Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
It was the about face heard around the world. Welcome to the Wednesday edition as President Trump changes his tune on the war in Ukraine, saying that Kyiv is now in position to retake the territories it has lost to Russia. And maybe more. Following President Trump's meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, we're going to get the latest on this from Bloomberg national security expert Nick Wadhams with insights today from Anja Manuel at Aspen Strategy Group, an important conversation you won't want to miss. With analysis from our political panel, Bloomberg politics contributor, Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano is with us, alongside Republican strategist Maura Gillespie from Bluestack Strategies. And we'll have it all after a look at Wall Street. Let's set the baseline right now with Charlie Pellet at World Headquarters in New York. His view on the markets. Charlie, how are we doing?
Thank you very much, Joe Mathieu. That baseline lower right now with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red. We're very close to session lows on the S&P 500 index. However, the stock market is holding near its record, underpinned by the belief that the economy is not falling off a cliff and growth will be bolstered by improving corporate profits, the AI boom, and rate reduction. So here's where we stand. S&P today down 24, 66.32, down by about 0.4%. We've got the Dow Industrials down 135 on the Dow, a decline right now of just about 0.3%, while NASDAQ is down 108 for the composite index, a drop of 0.5%. Our Mag 7 index lower, little change, down 0.1%. 10-year currently yielding 4.13%, with the 2-year 3.59%. Gold now down $28 the ounce, down 0.7%. West Texas Intermediate crude rallying 2.3%, 64.83 a barrel, and Bitcoin up 1.5%, 113,716 on Bitcoin. Alibaba ADRs are soaring after the company said it will spend more than a previous 3-year investment budget on AI infrastructure, just as investors turn more positive on its push in the technology. Companies also announced a partnership with NVIDIA. Alibaba ADRs are up 8.5%. NVIDIA shares, though, part of a tech decline today. Right now, we've got NVIDIA down by 1.1%. Again, recapping here, stocks are moving lower. S&P down by about 0.4%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. And back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Mathieu.
Appreciate that, Charlie. We'll have more from Charlie Pellet on Wall Street in about 20 minutes' time here on Balance of Power. Thank you for being with us on the Wednesday edition here on Bloomberg TV and radio. You can also find us on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. As Washington reels and many world capitals reel from the most recent post from President Trump regarding the war in Ukraine. He's back in Washington now. Of course, was at UNGA yesterday, the United Nations General Assembly. We brought you his address live here on Bloomberg. That was followed by a series of bilateral meetings, including one with Volodymyr Zelensky, talking, of course, about the war in Ukraine, just weeks after President Trump hosted Vladimir Putin at a summit in Alaska with hopes of finding some path to peace. That, of course, has not emerged. Vladimir Putin has continued to attack civilian neighborhoods and increase the level of bombardment and drone attacks across the entire country of Ukraine. Following that meeting with Zelensky, President Trump posted again. It was before he headed home last evening to write, "I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form." Going on to say, the original borders from where this war started, very much an option. He called Russia a paper tiger. Said later Ukraine will be able to take back their country in its original form, and who knows, maybe even go further than that. It is unclear exactly what he meant by certain elements of this post, but clearly a different tune, a different emotion from the president who also just a few months ago excoriated President Zelensky in the Oval Office, saying he didn't have the cards, no leverage. We've heard lines like "it takes two to tango." Zelensky was asked about all of this in an interview on Fox News, clearly surprised himself by what President Trump said. Let's listen.
So we understand now that we are ready to finish this war as quick as possible. And he wants, and I want, and our people want. But he understands that Putin doesn't want, and he understands that he is not winning, but he says to everybody that he will win. And I see very It was a little bit surprise for me. You're right. I was very positive signals from the side that Trump and America will be with us to the end of the war.
Clearly surprised, as I'm guessing Nick Wadhams was as well. Bloomberg's national security team leader is in New York to cover the United Nations meetings and with us now on Bloomberg. Nick, it's great to have you from New York. You know the line out there. It all has to do with whomever President Trump talked to last. Is it as simple as that in this case, or did he have other conversations around the UN, maybe other phone calls recently that changed his mind, or maybe Vladimir Putin has simply worn out his welcome?
Well, I think it's probably a mixture of all of those. Certainly, he has been a lot more impatient with Putin. He came in thinking, Putin wanted to do a deal, and he thought he could have this thing wrapped up pretty quickly. Obviously, it has not turned out that way. I think the subtext, though, of that tweet in particular, or that social media post, is maybe a little more unsettling than folks may think. I mean, if you read to the end, he says, "I wish both countries well. Will continue to supply weapons. Good luck to all." I mean, so there is a theory of the case out there that essentially what he's doing is stepping away from this whole thing. So the U.S. is gonna send weapons to European countries to sell weapons to European countries, and they could then send them on to Ukraine. But he's not otherwise getting involved. And, so in some ways, when you look at this, you think, okay, maybe it's a change of heart. But at the same time, it also looks a little bit like a stepping back, which is definitely not what European countries in Ukraine would want.
Yeah, well, you're changing the way I think we're all looking at this as we speak, Nick. In any event, he writes, I wish both countries well. We'll continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with them.
Right.
Good luck to all. And he signs it. Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America. Was that his mic drop then?
Well, I mean, that's a great question because, it feels like we've had so many mic drops from the president. He's got a lot of mics to drop, I guess. I mean, the interesting thing here, and it's always a dangerous game to try to parse the president's words and social media posts, because one suspects that these do not go through any sort of vetting process and maybe just reflect where his head is at that moment. But, for a long time, we were hearing essentially this administration from the president on down all say that Ukraine was going to have to make concessions on land. And it was coming out of that meeting with Vladimir Putin. The expectation at the time was that we were going to be on a path to some sort of concrete plan that would involve land swaps. Russia took land after the invasion, and it was likely that they were never going to give it up. Now, President Trump is essentially saying, yes, we think Ukraine can get back all of its land. So whether or not the U.S. is involved, clearly he heard something that makes him think Ukraine can be successful there. That's what we're really trying to figure out. What was said in that meeting with Zelensky, or what piece of information did the president get to think that that it's possible Ukraine could retake all its land? Of course, the big question for us is, does the president even remember that he said earlier that concessions might be necessary? And does he sort of acknowledge that seemed to be a policy that he was holding, or is he now just sort of shifting on to something else? It's just so confusing. Wow. It's really hard to make sense of what the president actually believes.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why we're talking this out, because we're not going to figure that out definitively in this conversation. There's a whole other theory out there right now, Nick, that Vladimir Putin is steps ahead and is in fact trying to divide NATO by flying these incursions, fighter jets or drones, into NATO countries like Poland and Estonia, causing them to scramble jets. And the president yesterday said NATO should shoot down Russian jets that breach their airspace, which, by the way, would be a very new and escalatory policy here. The idea, though, that, for instance, Hungary may not agree with this, or some other NATO members, what will Turkey think of this? And Putin is well aware that he could add a whole new stress point to the NATO alliance with the help of Donald Trump saying things like this. Does that hit home for you?
Well, I think, wouldn't necessarily be four-dimensional chess to suggest that, Vladimir Putin is testing the boundaries of the NATO alliance, and also testing its will to push back. So, yes, there is the idea that, Putin is sort of a master strategic thinker, but in a lot of ways, this feels pretty obvious. We've known for a long time that he's wanted to drive a wedge between the U.S. and other members of NATO and within Europe, members of the European community like Hungary, for example, that are a little more in his camp versus others. And this would be a good way to do it. I mean, Russian aircraft testing the boundaries both at NATO and in the U.S. I'm thinking up, where the U.S. and Russia border each other, Alaska and the Russian Far East. You've seen many times in the last many years where U.S. fighter jets have been deployed to keep an eye on Russian aircraft that drift a little close to the U.S. border. So I think it's safe to assume that any time you see this happen, it is not a mistake, especially when manned Russian aircraft are involved. Of course, should be said that Russia denies that that's what happens here. They say they were flying on a well-established corridor. But yes, I think there is that desire to cause that, to create that wedge between the U.S. and Europe. And then, it also does just create confusion because you have Trump saying that, but, he said that about shooting down jets hours after Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, said, listen, no, we should not be shooting down these jets unless Russia actually attacks. So, again, you're seeing a lot of the confusion about what exactly U.S. policy is right now.
Always a fascinating conversation, if not a definitive one, with Nick Wadhams. Good luck with your coverage at the UN, Nick, and thank you, as always, for being with us. Just want to mention very quickly a red headline just crossed the terminal. It's not having to do with this, but, in fact, Oracle launching an $18 billion investment-grade bond sale. Oracle shares, which have been on a tear lately, are down about 3.5% now, still holding above $300. As we consider the options moving forward here, and whether, in fact, President Trump is leaning into Ukraine or dropping the mic, I think the options we just established with Nick Wadhams. We wanted to spend some time with Anja, Manuel, Aspen Strategy Group Executive Director, former U.S. diplomat. I remember having a really fascinating conversation last time you were on, Anja, and things have changed a bit with regard to the president's tune here, and I'm wondering if you take him at his word.
Good to be with you, Joe. Yes, I think this is a big turn in policy, and it's very welcome. And I think Vladimir Putin has finally worn out the patience of this president, which is a good thing and a long time coming. So I hope that now the U.S. backs this welcome statement by President Trump with action. If you look at what the Biden administration did, they gave over $66 billion in military and other assistance to Ukraine. The President Trump and his administration have not said no to that. Now NATO will pay for those arms. They're just starting to flow. I think $1 billion has been released, but that's obviously too little, too late. We need to do more faster to actually give the Ukrainians what they need to win back, maybe not all the territory, but even some of the territory, to put themselves in a better negotiating position. Because as we've learned with Vladimir Putin, you don't get anywhere unless you get there from strength.
Well, that's right. And so I'm curious what type of strength the president is referring to here. Donald Trump writes, Putin and Russia are in big economic trouble, and this is the time for Ukraine to act. Is he talking about a military offensive or some sort of economic maneuver that we're not talking about?
Yeah, I can't speculate on what the president meant, but Russia is in big economic trouble. They have put their entire economy on a war footing, so that's artificially propping up GDP growth. I do think, even though it was a little ham-handed to just punish India, the idea of really trying to do our best to crack down on some of these Russian oil exports, to put on maybe some limited secondary sanctions. It's hard to get those to work perfectly, but the idea of putting more pressure on Putin is very welcome. And I also would say I really welcome the president's remarks about NATO airspace sovereignty. As you know, Putin sent a bunch of drones over into Poland. That was not an error, as you and Nick discussed. I think the Poles reacted right in exactly the right way. Denmark, it's a little less clear. And Putin does this perfectly. He always tests and tests and tests until somebody pushes back hard. So I'm glad we're pushing back.
Well, how far should we push back? President says you ought to shoot them down. You get MiG-31s in your airspace, you shoot them down. That's also a pretty good way to start a war, correct? The Russians are pretty good about implying different motives when they're caught in the act. Our fighter pilots for decades have been intercepting Russian Bear bombers and fighter jets in airspace over Alaska, for instance. Should we be shooting down Russian jets if they incur an Article 4 as opposed to 5 offensive here?
Look, I think you leave this to the NATO planners and strategists. Obviously, we stick to NATO Article 5, which means an attack on one is an attack on all. So far, what you've seen from the Russians is incursions via drones, not so much manned jets. So I think the idea that NATO is standing together, I thought the Europeans did really well this summer when you had Mark Rutte from NATO and a bunch of European leaders show up at the Oval Office to say, basically, we stand with you, America, we stand with you, Ukraine. And that's kind of the strong symbolism that Vladimir Putin needs to see.
We heard from Volodymyr Zelensky today at the UN. It was his chance to speak from the same speaker's rostrum that we saw Donald Trump in yesterday. He spoke to the veracity of institutions, and there's been a big conversation about that this week. Certainly President Trump tried to engage in one yesterday as he chastised the UN for doing little more than writing strongly worded letters. So I want you to hear what President Zelensky had to say earlier today, and we'll have you respond. Let's listen.
Even during bloodshed, there isn't a single international institution that can truly stop it. That's how weak these institutions have become. What can Sudan or Somalia or Palestine or any other people living through war really expect from the UN or the global system?
If you're having a hard time hearing that on the radio, he was referring to Sudan, Somalia, or Palestine, any other people, he said, living through war, what they should really expect from the UN and the global system. Do we expect too much from this institution holding its General Assembly this week?
Yeah, I think international institutions are only as powerful and effective as its members allow them to be. And the United Nations is a collection of member states. And so if the most senior leaders of that on the Security Council disagree, obviously the UN is hampered in its effectiveness. But I would say, look, the U.S. attacking the UN as being ineffective is not new. We also still foot a large part of the bill. And to echo what President Zelensky said, the UN does an enormous amount of good. They deploy 70,000 peacekeepers around the world. The World Food Program feeds 150 million people a year. The World Health Organization coordinates responses to big public health outbreaks. So there are a lot of things that the UN is doing, even if it may not be possible for that institution to solve the biggest wars unless its members permit it to do that.
Really something. I'm not sure where we're going here, Anja, but we'd love to stay in touch with you on this because this does feel like a bit of an inflection point, and I'm glad you could spend some time with us today on Bloomberg. From the Aspen Strategy Group, the executive director, former U.S. diplomat Anja Manuel, with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Glad you're along today on the Wednesday edition. We're going to assemble our panel next with much more to talk about here in Washington. It's not just geopolitics, but domestic politics we pay attention to, with truly 1 week to the day before a possible government shutdown. If they can't figure out a deal, it will be, in fact, next Wednesday that you and I are here talking about what agencies are going to stay open and which might have to wait, who will be essential and who will not. This is another inflection point we'll get into with our panel next, only here on Bloomberg. As we keep our eyes not only on the House of Representatives, but the state of Arizona. This is something that may not have been on your radar, but it's going to bring the whole Jeffrey Epstein story back to the fore here. And yes, everyone in Washington does know this, even if they're not talking about it. Adelita Grijalva, the daughter of the longtime Arizona congressman who died of cancer earlier this year in March, Raul Grijalva, won the race to succeed her dad last night. This was a special election, one of two that we were following, right? The other was in Virginia a couple of weeks ago. That was a slam dunk for the Democrat, Jerry Connolly's old seat. This apparently was a slam dunk for the Democrat as well. The daughter of the now late incumbent. When she is sworn in, you thought Republicans had a narrow margin. The Republican majority in the House will go to 219, 214, 2 remaining vacancies. Now, that's one problem for Mike Johnson. Here's the other. The future Congresswoman from Arizona has pledged to sign the discharge petition to release the Epstein files. And guess what? Only one more vote is needed. So this is apparently about to happen. Remembering you need 218 on there. Grijalva made it very clear that she will join the effort as soon as she is sworn in, which is expected to happen next week when everybody comes back to town. It's where we start with our political panel. Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg politics contributor and Democratic analyst, is with us. She is Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Republican strategist Maura Gillespie with Bluestack Strategies, and a veteran of John Boehner's Speaker's Office. Great to have you both here. Jeannie, Democrats, as it turns out, we had been asking about this weeks ago, will in fact be the party to put the discharge petition on the floor. Will it go any further?
It may not go to the Senate, but it's certainly coming to the floor of the House. And it's not just Democrats. We have Tom Massey. We have the 3 women who are Republicans who have signed on and said, despite pressure from the White House, their signatures will remain. And then, of course, you have Virginia Foxx, the chair of the Rules Committee, who says she's not going to try to stop it. So this thing is going to barrel ahead to the floor. I don't think it's going to go far in the Senate, but they are going to force Republicans to take a stand on releasing these documents. So, Joe, you thought Epstein was something of the past? He keeps rearing up again.
Yeah, it's like that hand that comes out of the water at the end of the horror movie. Maura, what's the conversation happening right now inside the Speaker's office as Mike Johnson loses control of this matter?
It's a matter of how do we deal with President Trump and his reaction to this, really, because it's happening. As you mentioned, this is going to force Republicans to be on record. They can tout to their constituents that they stand for transparency and they want answers. They want to do it through proper order. And that's the messaging that they'll probably come up with. But I think that what we're going to see is a real pressure campaign by the White House. And then it'll be up to Speaker Johnson how he communicates this with the president, reminding him that this has put his members in a position where they have to be on record for it. But I agree that it won't go to the Senate. It'll just be a messaging tool.
Well, okay, a messaging tool is really what it has been so far, Jeannie, which is a problem for President Trump. Does it also threaten to sideline any potential deal around government funding? Because we are a week away now. This would be the first day of a shutdown next week if it happens.
Yeah, I don't see the Epstein issue as having that much of an impact on the shutdown. I think we are unfortunately barreling towards a shutdown regardless of what happens. I don't even think that Donald Trump canceling tomorrow's meeting with the Democratic leadership is having that much impact. You know, unfortunately, I think Democrats have their back against the wall. I don't think they should do what they are doing, as you know, Joe, but they're doing it. And I think they don't have a choice, because if they decided to capitulate, their base would just rebel. And so I think we are going to barrel towards a shutdown. And I think that is most unfortunate, because getting out of it is going to be terribly difficult.
Well, you know, Jeannie, you referred to Mike Johnson's preference. They wanted the Epstein matter to come through the Oversight Committee and not have to deal with what they call a partisan discharge petition. You remember Mike Lawler wanted to have a big shouting match about this when I was asking about his potential vote on the discharge. And he was yelling so much, we really didn't get a lot done in that conversation. But it really underscored how sensitive this is for those who are allied with Mike Johnson to not see it go this way, not with Tom Massey and the rest. They want to have some control over this in the Oversight Committee. Will that parallel effort continue if the discharge petition hits the floor?
You know, I think Mike Johnson has been basically trying to make the case this is redundant. We don't need it. We're already addressing this through proper channels. As Maura said, I think he'll continue to make that case. But it is, to your point, a very sensitive issue for Republicans, and they are going to feel the heat from the White House. I mean, there have been talk of threats from the White House already for the last several weeks. And so I think this is just going to continue to be a mess. Quite frankly, I don't see why the president doesn't just call for everything to be released, because this is worse for him, this back and forth on it.
Well, of course, he did on the campaign trail, which is why we keep talking about this. Jeannie, it's not something we'd be pursuing, I think, otherwise. But I want to get into the shutdown stuff with you here, Maura. We heard from Chuck Schumer. He showed up on TV this morning. I realize everybody's on recess right now, but no tie for the Democratic leader as he sat down on MSNBC and made clear that we have a problem. Let's listen.
We know how bad it is. And we're asking something very simple, Joe, for the president to sit down and talk with us. You know, he's not the king. He can't just dictate what happened. He said he doesn't need Democrats. Well, then he doesn't know how to count, because there are 60 votes in this Senate that you need to pass this, and he's got 53.
And of course, he's referring to the fact that President Trump yesterday decided that he would not be meeting with the Democratic leadership. Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries have both been pressing for this meeting. And President Trump is not going to be playing along. Many folks see that as kind of the final straw, Maura, that there's just no way we're going to get around this, even if it's a brief shutdown. We are shutting down. And as somebody who's been in the Speaker's office, I wonder if you agree.
I don't think that a shutdown was ever a good decision. I've been through a couple. But I think what happened in March with Schumer not following through on it and Jeffries wanting to, they have to be lockstep. And even though I think the biggest problem is that they don't know how to get out of this, they're heading towards it. One of the problems, too, and Jeannie mentioned, some of their backs are against the wall. Well, that's true. Republicans have control. They have the messaging control as well, because there is no way out for Democrats necessarily. They came to the table with these 3 major provisions that they wanted to talk to the president about tomorrow, which in reality, they probably should have just gone in with 1 or 2. I don't think these are 3 pretty lofty ones: the Obamacare subsidies, rolling back some things from the One Big Beautiful Bill, and then, talking about the rescissions issues. I think if they'd focused on one, maybe they'd have better success. But doing so, you've got 7 days until shutdown is happening. That's the reality they're playing in right now. And Republicans will say that this is, they gave a bill, they put a bill forward. The House is already in recess and Johnson's not bringing them back. And so it really does come down to what Thune can get accomplished here.
Hakeem Jeffries on Twitter, on X, Jeannie, Trump always chickens out. The Democratic leader goes for the taco. Donald Trump just canceled a high-stakes meeting in the Oval. He says the extremists want to shut down the government because they are unwilling to address the Republican health care crisis that is devastating America. We've talked about the Fabrizio polling numbers over the potential expiration of these Obamacare subsidies that would increase premiums for a lot of people. Jeannie, that could mean the midterms for Republicans. Is Hakeem Jeffries on the right talking points?
I think he's on the right talking point with regard to the cancellation of the meeting. A big problem for Democrats is, and which is why I believe they should have taken the clean CR and negotiated during the approach process on this, because they are right. The subsidies the expiration is going to hit very hard. But the problem for Democrats is if they are seen as shutting down the government, and then these notices on the subsidy increases go out in October, and they will be devastating. I think it's going to be very, very hard to message this over Donald Trump. And so that's the problem. And I also think they should look at the reality that Donald Trump, in my estimation, not Republicans, but Donald Trump, he wants a shutdown of this government. That's why he is not meeting. That's why they are moving in the way they are. I think he sees that as beneficial to him and, of course, to Russ' vote. And so I think this is a problem for Democrats. But again, I am in the total minority. I also think that Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries have no choice. The base would rebel, the rank and file would rebel if they turned around again like Schumer did last time. So they are going to move right towards it. They have no choice at this point.
You're hearing from a Washington insider when they refer to appropriations as approps, which is partly why I love you both. Maura, we've only got a minute left here. Does President Trump march up to Capitol Hill? Or is the story true that Russ Vote has a plan and they can't wait for it to close?
Well, I think if you remember, the president will have extra powers about the budget and how spending is, how we do spending in this country. And so, yes, he does want to a shutdown, I think, in a little bit of ways, because, again, shows the powers he has. I think that's probably what Thune and Johnson reminded him, that the shutdown may be beneficial for him because he has discretionary spending at his disposal. He gets to do some things that maybe he wouldn't get to do otherwise, and any legal challenges won't hold up in court because he has presidential immunity.
Remember this conversation a week from today. Our great panel, Maura, Gillespie, Bluestack Strategies, and of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeannie Shanzano. Thank you both for the insights. We'll have a lot more ahead here on Balance of Power as we count down, yes, to a possible shutdown. The countdown clocks won't be out till next week. This is Bloomberg. We spent most of yesterday's program bringing you conversations with a lot of the world leaders who have assembled at the UN this week in New York. In fact, it was right at this time we were talking with the president of Latvia yesterday. But one of the stories hanging over this collection of world leaders is one you did hear about on Bloomberg that we want to spend a bit of time on now. The Secret Service thwarting a plot to take out cell service near the UN. Imagine a room full of SIM cards and servers. The FBI or Secret Service uncovered this, not actually in Manhattan, but just outside of the city. And we wanted to talk with Myles Miller about this, Bloomberg senior Homeland Security reporter who has the byline on this story on the terminal and is, in fact, with me here in Washington. I'm glad someone else is around here. Myles, it's good to see you. Give us a sense, just first of all, people hear about all these SIM cards. How would this be used to shut down phone service?
So basically, the way that this was set up was these were basically what they call a SIM card farm.
Yeah.
Stacks and stacks of SIM cards into basically servers in places strategically placed around the city. So up north in some Wall Street suburbs, Armonk and Greenwich, which is really strange.
Yeah.
And then out to northern New Jersey, Queens. And so to encircle New York's cellular grid and then have the ability to do mass fraud. So send a text message to a bunch of people saying, you know, your car's warranty is expired, your Amazon package is not getting there, or also to call 911 all at the same time and jam up the system. That is what Secret Service believes happened here. The way they got here is because there were phone calls made to people close to the president, to people close to the West Wing, one person, a senior official in the Secret Service, and they said, wait, this is not a teenager doing a swatting. This could be something bigger. And so they started to investigate and found these SIM card farms in places really close to the city right before the UN General Assembly.
So the president got some prank phone calls? That's what tipped them off here?
No. So it's actually very interesting the way that the Secret Service source put this. It was people close to the president who got these calls. And, you know, the goal with these bad actors is that they can try to influence someone close to the president. They can't get to him. They don't have his number. But you could find the numbers of people close to him and try to, you know, infiltrate, try to influence. And luckily the Secret Service was on it and did an investigation into it.
Remembering that Susie Wiles and Marco Rubio have both been targeted in this way recently, do we have any sense, based on your reporting, how they track the source of an effort like this? How'd they find the SIM cards?
Yeah, so they basically, going through cell tower data, were able to pinpoint where these calls are coming from. And then they're like, wait, these are all from sort of the same area.
Interesting.
And then based off of that, did more investigative digging. They created a new team of sleuths in the Secret Service who did the digging. And as part of that, were able to find these cell networks. And they were, interestingly enough, networks that have been used by foreign governments and have been used by cartels in the past as well. And so they're trying to figure out who's behind all of this.
Well, of course, that's the next question, right? We hear Russia's suspected, but will they ever actually know?
Well, you know, they've not yet said what country is behind it. And they made great pains to not say that during UN week, because if the president happens to be meeting with some of these countries, perhaps in a couple of weeks, they don't want anything sticky coming up before the president's been able to make the case to whoever the world leader is.
Maybe we learn more after everyone goes home, presumably?
Well, let's see.
So I've got to ask you, you know, it takes our senior Homeland Security reporter to get to the bottom of Escalator Gate. The fact that this even took place yesterday is a riot. We heard from the president when he was in the speaker's rostrum at the UN. I've only got two things from the United Nations: a broken escalator and a bad teleprompter. There was an insinuation last evening. We're showing this, by the way, to our viewers on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube. The president and First Lady.
Pay good attention to the photographer who went up the escalator first.
That's right. A photographer heading ahead of them Now the escalator stops. The president's looking at somebody to fix it. The first lady marches up on her own, and he follows reluctantly.
You know, the one thing about like New York and also here in D.C., when the escalator breaks, people stop and don't keep going, and you see how human they are here.
Correct.
The UN has told us that a videographer from the U.S. delegation who was traveling with the president, reading here, I don't want to get anything wrong,
Thank you.
was traveling backward up the escalator and stopped onto the bottom of it and may have inadvertently triggered the safety function described above.
Yes.
I'm leaving it at that.
Step.
The Secret Service is going to investigate. I got a call from a very pained Secret Service source yesterday who said, we are investigating this. Turn on Fox News. Caroline Leavitt is talking about it right now.
You said, what? You're calling me with this? Caroline Leavitt on X. If someone at the UN intentionally stopped the escalator as the president and first lady were stepping on, they need to be fired and investigated immediately. She says the Times reported this on Sunday. This is the funny part. The Times of London.
Right.
In fact, suggested this might happen, that UN staff members have joked they may turn off the escalators, have them walk up the stairs, and tell them that they ran out of money. We don't believe that was the case.
We don't. And, I think the UN took great pains to make it clear that they had done their own research and made sure that, they actually brought in their mechanic to see what was happening. They have a log of all these things. Listen, we did a story the other day about UN security and how tight that place is during UN week. And I went into the security room and saw all the cameras and everything. If something untoward had happened there, that room with those agents inside would have seen it and would have stopped it. It appears as though this escalator just wasn't working. But Secret Service, listen, to their credit, is going to do this investigation just to make sure everything was above board.
As I mentioned, it takes Myles Miller to put Escalator Gate to bed in just 24 hours' time. It's great to have you in Washington. Thank you for being with us, as always. Great to spend time with Myles here on Bloomberg on this day after Jimmy Kimmel returned to air. If you were here in Washington, D.C., you might not have known, because the television station, it's an ABC affiliate, Channel 7 here in Washington, D.C., is owned by the company Sinclair, which decided not to follow along with the network and bring Jimmy Kimmel Live back on. In fact, Sinclair and a separate station group have decided to continue running alternative programming. They've put some sort of news package together that's running at 11:30 at night. The rest of the nation, with the exception of a few cities, I think it was about 70 stations in total, did not take part. Rest of the nation watched Jimmy Kimmel returned to air following his indefinite suspension and the remarks that he made about the killing of Charlie Kirk. He did not apologize in his extended monologue, but he did say this.
And the truth is, I don't think what I have to say is going to make much of a difference. If you like me, you like me. If you don't, you don't. I have no illusions about changing anyone's mind. But I do want to make something clear because it's important to me as a human, and that is, you understand that it was never my intention to make light of the murder of a young man. I don't.
You heard him get choked up there in what was clearly an emotional moment for Jimmy Kimmel. Unclear if the other stations will take part in his return to the airwaves. The president does not want to see that happen. In fact, as soon as President Trump found out about this yesterday, he got on Truth Social with another missive aimed at ABC, suggesting that there will be some sort of legal action in this particular case. He said, I can't believe ABC Fake News gave Jimmy Kimmel his job back. The White House was told by ABC his show was canceled. Something happened between then and now because his audience is gone and his talent was never there. He did suggest, though, last time I went after them, he says, they gave me $16 million. This one sounds even more lucrative. Chris Palmeri covers the media and entertainment business for us in our Los Angeles bureau, and joining us from L.A. On behalf of Bloomberg News. Chris Palmeri, welcome back to Balance of Power. Look, this is a big deal for Disney. Will it be able to get all of its affiliates on board?
We'll see. I wouldn't, there are two big ones, Nexstar and Sinclair. Nexstar was sort of the more even-keeled of it in his messages, although I don't anticipate them bringing Kimmel back tonight. Sinclair was much more strident in its initial comments last week, saying they wanted Kimmel to formally apologize and donate to Charlie Kirk's causes. while he maybe stopped short of using the word apologize last night, Kimmel was definitely very conciliatory and
sure,
and most
absolutely.
people would say extended quite a lot in that direction.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of the president's post? Does Disney have any response to it? Will there be a separate lawsuit that comes from this?
Disney has declined to comment on the post. I would think it's fair to say they're bracing for just about everything in the Trump era. A number of things could happen. He could sue as he suggests he would. Of course, he did that regarding ABC News last year, and ABC settled, as he mentioned. Now, that was a very specific incident. His complaint with Kimmel seems much more broad, sort of similar to his lawsuit against the New York Times, that they're just against me and an agent of the Democrats. And, there is also other levers that the administration could take. A company like Disney has to get approval for mergers and acquisitions and sales and things, and all of that could come into play.
Well, a lot's been made of this pending merger with Tegna, and I wonder what your thought is on that, Chris, if you have one, to the extent to which this potential merger is driving decisions by these station owners.
Well, of course, they'll tell you no, that's not the reason they decided to take Kimmel off the air. But there is no doubt that Nexstar needs not just approval to transfer Tegna's licenses from the FCC. They need to get major rule changes, something the broadcast industry has been pushing for years, to take away these limits on how many stations they can own per market and nationally. And so Sinclair is also in a similar position. They don't have a deal awaiting approval, but they've said that they're looking at all kind of options it offers for mergers. So both of them want to get those rules lifted and need to get approval for any deals from the FCC.
I had to notice yesterday, Chris, it was a big story, Disney hiking the cost of its Disney Plus subscriptions. That's going to be almost $20 a month. I don't know at what point it costs more than cable to have all these things, but we can do that conversation on another day. I bring it up because the story around Jimmy Kimmel is that it's a money loser, that the show is in fact losing money for ABC. That might be the case for all of these late night shows. How do we see it? Is it a lost leader? Does ABC need Jimmy Kimmel Live?
No, they don't need it, and it is to some degree a lost leader. I mean, that's changed because the whole business has changed so much. And we've seen talk shows canceled, and people just aren't watching traditional TV like they used to. Kimmel's ratings are down about more than a third from where they were 10 years ago. There's a couple exceptions to that, but it's just a format that's not as invigorated as it was years ago, and so wouldn't be surprised to see it fade out. And Disney is just like other networks are just sort of watching and waiting for the right moment to do so.
Well, I'll tell you, you take 70 stations off the list here, and I can't imagine what that's going to do to his ratings in the meantime, but it's something I'm sure you'll be writing about, Chris. Come back and talk to us again about it. Chris Palmeri, Bloomberg News senior editor and entertainment team leader, with us live from the L.A. Bureau, live from Hollywood on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We'll have a lot more to talk about when we meet again on the late edition of Balance of Power, and I hope that you will join. It starts at 5 p.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We'll have a lot more to talk about following this decision by ABC to put Jimmy Kimmel back on the air, and we'll play it to our panel a bit later on. Also, big questions about a government shutdown that would begin a week from today if it happens. Sarah Chamberlain from the Republican Main Street Partnership will join us, along with Bloomberg Politics contributor Adam Hodge, to get a better sense of what exactly we're counting down to. I'll meet you back here then. Bloomberg Business Week Daily is up next, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.